The night the mystery began was colder than anyone expected for early autumn in rural Idaho, the kind of cold that slipped under doors and settled into empty spaces like an unwelcome visitor. A quiet wind moved through the thin pine trees that lined the edge of Clearwater County, brushing against old barn walls and the windows of houses already turning dark for the night. The roads were mostly empty, except for the occasional pickup rolling past, its tires whispering across the fatting asphalt. Nothing about the night felt unusual, and yet, somewhere in that stillness, a moment was quietly forming that would haunt the town for years. In a small rental cabin just outside Orofino, 26-year-old Jenna Caldwell was finishing a late shift of paperwork from her job at a rafting tour company. She wasn't supposed to be working this late, but the end of the season always meant extra tasks, final bookings, and closing accounts, and she liked staying ahead of things. A warm mug of cocoa sat beside her as she flipped through forms, tapping her pen lightly every few seconds. She had always been known for her discipline and steady focus, traits she had carried since childhood. Her friends often teased her, calling her the organizer, a title she wore with a shy laugh and a proud smile. Jenna's cabin was modest, built in the 1980s, with soft lighting, an old space heater humming in the corner, and a row of photographs lined along the kitchen counter. One picture showed her at age 10, holding a fishing rod as her father kneeled proudly beside her. Another showed her standing in front of a bright red raft, smiling after her first day guiding tourists through the Clearwater River. The outdoors had always been her comfort, her identity, and her joy. The river, the trails, the woods, they were not just places to her, they were home. Jenna lived alone, but she had never felt lonely. She had friends from work, regular customers who returned every summer and greeted her like family, and a younger sister, Rachel, who called almost every night, sometimes for advice, sometimes just to share silly stories about her college life. On this night, Rachel had called earlier, and Jenna had promised they would go hiking that weekend to photograph the fall colors before the leaves disappeared. That promise would remain unkept. Sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., Jenna set aside her work, stretched her arms, and stepped outside for fresh air. The forest around her was dark, but she wasn't afraid. She had spent most of her life wandering through places just like this. The silence was comforting. The moonlight glowed faintly through the tree branches, and she breathed deeply, enjoying the crisp air before heading back inside. What happened next has no witnesses, no recordings, no final phone call to capture the moment. All that's known is that before sunrise, Jenna vanished from her cabin, leaving no signs of struggle, no footprints in the dirt, no broken objects, no notes, and no trace of where she had gone. The next morning, Jenna failed to show up at work. At first, her coworkers weren't alarmed. People got sick, cars didn't start, alarms didn't ring. But by noon, when she still hadn't answered calls or messages, concern grew. She had never missed a shift without warning. By late afternoon, her supervisor drove to her cabin, expecting to find her asleep or dealing with car trouble. Instead, she found Jenna's car still parked, unlocked, with her purse inside. The sight sent a sharp wave of dread through her. She stepped to the door and knocked. No answer. She tried again. Silence. With shaking hands, she contacted the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived quickly. The door was locked, suggesting Jenna had stepped outside willingly or left with someone she trusted. Inside, everything was neat. Her paperwork from the night before sat on the table, the cocoa mug half finished, now cold. An officer walked through each room, calling her name even though he already knew she wouldn't respond. Outside, they combed through the surrounding forest, searching for any indication of where she might have gone. They found nothing. News of her disappearance spread quickly across the small community. Residents gathered in volunteer search groups, walking through thick brush, climbing over fallen logs, calling her name into the silent woods. Helicopters hovered overhead, scanning from the sky. Divers explored sections of the river. For days, then weeks, the search expanded and intensified, yet the outcome remained the same: nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a trail. It was as if she had walked out of her cabin and dissolved into the night air. The investigation pressed forward with every resource Clearwater County could offer. Detectives interviewed coworkers, family members, old acquaintances, and even tourists who had recently visited the rafting company. Jenna had no enemies, no conflicts, no debts, no troubling relationships. She wasn't dating anyone at the time, and her closest friends insisted she had no intention of leaving town. Her sister Rachel told officers repeatedly that Jenna had been excited about their weekend plans and had sounded completely normal on the phone. There was no reason to believe she had run off or chosen to disappear. As weeks turned to months, the absence of leads became its own torment. Detectives held evidence boxes that contained almost nothing useful. A few fingerprints in her cabin, all confirmed to be hers. A shoe print just outside the back door, proven to come from one of the officers. They checked phone records, bank statements, email accounts, hunting licenses, fishing permits, medical facilities, bus stations, airports, nothing. Missing person flyers were posted in nearby towns, then farther cities, then across the state. No one recognized her. No one reported sightings. The case drifted into the dreaded stage where hope and doubt collided, leaving everyone uncertain which feeling to trust. Rachel found herself calling Jenna's phone every night for months, not because she thought she'd answer, but because the ringing made Jenna feel closer, if only for a moment. Her parents visited Idaho several times, searching on their own, talking to locals, handing out more flyers, and begging for any information, even rumors. They returned home each time with fewer words and heavier hearts. By early 2007, 9 months after Jenna vanished, the sheriff's office officially classified it as a cold case. It wasn't an ending. It was a pause, a painful, indefinite pause. Rumors grew as the years passed. Some people whispered that Jenna might have gotten lost in the woods, injured, and pushed too far from trails to be found. Others wondered if she might have accepted a ride from a stranger. A few insisted she must have known her abductor, because she wouldn't have opened her door for anyone she didn't trust. Others feared she had crossed paths with someone passing through town, someone whose name would never be known. With no evidence to prove or disprove anything, theories eventually blended into background noise. By 2011, the case had faded from newspapers, showing up only occasionally in articles about unsolved disappearances in Idaho. Rachel had grown into adulthood with a tightness in her chest that never loosened, an unanswered question that lived inside her like a quiet flame. She saved every photo, every flyer, every voicemail Jenna had ever sent her. Their parents aged more quickly than they should have, grief pressing into their skin like winter ice. Meanwhile, the evidence box containing Jenna's case remained tucked on a shelf in the sheriff's office, labeled in black marker and handled with reverence by those who remembered her story. Detectives transferred in and out over the years, but the mystery remained unchanged. A few investigators during slow periods would reopen the file, hoping fresh eyes might catch something overlooked. Every time, they reached the same dead end. But the world changed. Technology advanced. New investigative methods emerged across the country. Cold cases that had been frozen for decades were thawing, revealing answers through confessions, forensic breakthroughs, and unexpected witness accounts. And slowly, quietly, something was shifting in Idaho, though no one knew it yet. In 2022, a retired logging truck driver named Walter Grimes, who had moved to Oregon years earlier, stepped into a small police station in Pendleton with noticeable tremors in his hands. He asked to speak to an officer privately. They led him into a small room with a metal table, 2 chairs, and buzzing fluorescent lights. He sat down heavily, took a long breath, and began a conversation that would become the turning point in Jenna Caldwell's case. But he didn't reference her by name. Instead, he asked a question that set off immediate suspicion. "How long," he whispered, "does a person live with something they've done before the truth eats them alive?" The officers exchanged glances. They told him to continue. Walter leaned forward, rubbing his forehead. "This is about Idaho," he said, his voice strained. "Back in 2006, There was a woman, I never knew her name, but I know she didn't deserve what happened." The officers asked for details, but he hesitated. Hours passed. His story came out in fragments. He described driving through Idaho during long-haul routes, stopping in small towns for fuel or rest. He described seeing a woman outside a cabin one night and approaching her. He described a moment of anger he claimed he didn't understand, a confrontation, and a sudden, irreversible tragedy. The officers realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a rumor. This was a confession. But there was a problem. He didn't know the woman's name. He didn't know the date. He didn't know the exact location, only vague descriptions of the woods, the darkness, the cold. His story could match dozens of cases, or none. Still, his confession was too specific to ignore. And this was just the beginning. The officers in Pendleton contacted Idaho authorities the same night, sending a formal request for collaboration. They faxed over the notes, the audio clips, and the partial written confession Walter had managed to complete before growing too overwhelmed to continue. In Idaho, detectives who had never worked Jenna's case gathered around a long table in the small conference room, reading through the details with steady concentration. The older detectives who had been around back in 2006 were called in as well, their eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. For 16 years they had lived with an emptiness, a case that refused to give even a hint of closure. Now, a stranger's trembling confession had shaken loose the first movement in the long silent story. Detective Arlen Whitford, who had once been a rookie officer assisting in the early searches for Jenna, read through the packet 3 times before speaking. He remembered the cabin, the car, the untouched paperwork on the table. He remembered walking through the woods calling Jenna's name into branches that never answered. Her face had stayed with him all these years, appearing at unexpected moments in his mind, when he hiked past the river, when he drove past her old workplace, when he saw her name printed on the cold case board. And now someone had stepped forward, someone who claimed to know what happened to her. He leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers together, thinking through timelines, locations, distance, and possibility. It was too early to know if Walter's confession was real. But it was enough to reopen the file formally. 2 Idaho detectives traveled to Oregon the next morning to speak with Walter in person. He sat in the same room, shoulders hunched, fingers trembling as he rubbed the edges of his flannel sleeves. His face carried years of exhaustion and a heavy guilt that clung to him like fog. His voice was thin and unsteady when he greeted them. One detective set a recorder on the table. Another placed a stack of photographs, locations, cabins, roads, none labeled. They asked him to point out anything familiar. He stared at the images for a long time before tapping one with a slow, uncertain finger. A cabin surrounded by woods, a dirt path, a view that could have been dozens of similar places in Idaho. But when he tapped it, he whispered, "This looks like where she lived." They questioned him for hours, pressing gently but firmly, guiding him through memories blurred by stress, time, and the haze of choices he regretted every day since. He told them he had been drinking that night back in 2006, after a long haul of driving through Montana and Idaho. He said he stopped near Orofino to rest before continuing to Lewiston. He had pulled his truck over near a cabin where a light was still on. He didn't know the woman who lived there. He didn't plan anything. He described hearing her step outside. He remembered a brief exchange. He said something rude, she told him to leave. And then something inside him snapped. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't justify it. All he could say was that he acted out of rage he didn't fully understand. The detectives listened, their faces still and unreadable, but inside a storm churned. His details were imperfect, scattered, but the foundation of the story matched too much to ignore. He described grabbing her arm. He described a struggle. He described a moment where she stumbled. And he described panic, an overwhelming fear, and the decision to hide her body in a place he felt sure no one would ever search. The words came out choked and broken. He could barely speak when he described the cold air and the pine needles crunching under his boots. He could barely breathe when he said he had covered her with branches, convinced the forest would swallow her forever. When Idaho detectives returned home, they carried more than a stack of notes and recordings. They carried the first tangible lead the case had ever had. They began coordinating a search based on Walter's descriptions, his memory of a sloped hillside, a fallen tree, a patch of uneven ground. Even though 16 years had passed, they believed the location could still exist if they could pinpoint it. But forests change, trees fall, land shifts. Snow, storms, and time erase details easily. What Walter remembered might no longer resemble the present-day landscape at all. Still, they began searching. The sheriff's office organized small teams to comb through areas that matched what Walter described. They walked through thick brush, ducking under branches, climbing over logs, scanning the ground for anything that didn't look natural. They relied on old maps, satellite images from the mid-2000s, and Walter's vague recollections of how far he had walked from the road. Some days yielded nothing. Others yielded nothing even louder, the kind of disappointment that settled heavily onto the shoulders of every searcher. But they kept going, driven by a combination of duty, hope, and the unspoken desire to bring something home to Jenna's family after all these years. Rachel was notified of the confession the same week. She sat in her apartment in Washington, hands shaking as she read the voicemail from the detective. For 16 years she had lived between hope and grief, never fully stepping into either. She had imagined having answers someday, but she had also grown afraid of what those answers might be. Now a stranger's confession was pulling her back into the pain she had spent years learning to manage. She returned the call immediately. The detective explained the situation carefully, gently, assuring her that nothing was confirmed yet. She sat silently, listening, tears sliding down her face as she whispered, "Please find her. Please bring her home." As the search continued, Walter remained in custody in Oregon. His mental and physical health were deteriorating, and he seemed relieved that authorities were taking him seriously. His confession had not brought him peace, but it had lifted a small fraction of the weight he carried. Still, investigators needed more than words. They needed evidence. Confessions without physical proof could crumble in court, and no prosecutor would risk losing a case this important. In the late spring of 2023, a breakthrough finally arrived. A search team hiking near a steep wooded ridge found an area where the ground dipped in an unnatural shape, as though it had once been disturbed and had slowly settled over many seasons. The soil was slightly sunken. The moss growth differed from the surrounding patches. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. They called it in, marking the location and waiting for forensic specialists. The team arrived later that afternoon, digging with patience, documenting carefully, peeling back layers of earth 1 inch at a time. And then they found fabric. A small piece first, buried under roots, a faded scrap that had once been blue, then a shoe, then fragments of bone. The excavation was slow, delicate, and respectful. By evening, they had recovered remains that were immediately believed to belong to a woman. The medical examiner transported everything for analysis. Days later, the official report identified the remains through dental records. The news spread quietly at first, shared only among investigators, then delivered to Rachel by phone. She sat on her couch, clutching the armrest as the detective spoke. She had imagined this moment for 16 years, and yet nothing could have prepared her for the weight of it. She cried softly, not from shock, but from a grief that had waited so long to be acknowledged. She whispered thank you repeatedly until she could no longer speak. Jenna had been found. With her remains recovered, the case accelerated. Idaho prosecutors worked with Oregon authorities to transfer Walter to Idaho to face charges. They built their case with his confession, timelines, his truck's documented routes from 2006, and the newly discovered remains. Forensic experts confirmed that the fractures on certain bones were consistent with what Walter described. His clothing from the time, preserved in an old box in his garage, contained trace fibers that matched the cabin environment. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case steadily. When Walter was brought into Idaho under escort, he kept his eyes lowered, shoulders hunched, hands cuffed. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, shouting questions he would never answer. The community, stunned by the sudden developments, watched from afar as the man who claimed to be responsible for Jenna's disappearance shuffled inside to face the legal system. In interviews, old coworkers of Jenna spoke about her kindness, her patience, her calm presence. One neighbor described her as a light the woods seemed to borrow every time she stepped outside. The town felt the weight of her story returning, this time with clarity that hurt but finally offered truth. As the case prepared to move toward trial, Walter's public defender met with him repeatedly, reviewing the evidence and the confession. Walter barely spoke during these meetings. When he did, he offered no excuses, no defenses, no attempts to rewrite what he had admitted. His guilt was raw and unfiltered, a presence that consumed him. After weeks of discussion, it became clear he would not contest the charges. He intended to plead guilty. In early 2024, the courtroom filled with quiet tension as Walter entered, his expression hollow. Rachel sat in the first row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her parents, now older and frailer, sat on each side of her, leaning into her presence. The prosecutor read the details of the case, summarizing the events of 2006, the confession, the recovery of Jenna's remains, and the impact the crime had on the family and community. When asked to speak, Walter rose slowly, gripping the stand for support. His voice was barely audible at first. "I took something from the world that I can never replace," he said. "I took a daughter, a sister, a friend. I can't explain what I did. I can't defend it. I can only say I'm sorry, and I know that sorry means nothing compared to the hurt I caused. I hope someday someone can forgive me, but I don't expect it." Rachel looked at him, at the man who had taken her sister, and felt a complex mix of rage, sorrow, and strange, reluctant relief. The truth had finally stepped into the light. The mystery that had haunted her entire adult life was no longer a shadow. The judge sentenced Walter to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. When the courtroom emptied, Rachel walked outside and stood in the cold air for a long time, breathing deeply, feeling something inside her shift. The weight was still there, but it no longer dragged her down. She whispered Jenna's name into the wind, imagining her voice echoing through the trees where she had once laughed, once lived, once dreamed of future weekends that never came. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You're home now." In the weeks after the sentencing, Clearwater County slowly began to settle into a new rhythm, one shaped by the presence of answers but still carrying the echo of everything lost. The search teams who had spent years walking the forest trails found themselves stepping more quietly near the hillside where Jenna had been found, almost as though the woods themselves asked for gentler footsteps now that the truth had been uncovered. Locals who remembered her story placed flowers near the trailhead. Some wrote small notes tucked under stones, messages her family would never see, but that somehow felt meaningful to leave behind. In small towns, closure has its own quiet language. Rachel returned to Idaho a few weeks later, accompanied by her parents, who moved more slowly now, leaning on walking sticks as they made their way up the uneven ground near the place where Jenna's remains had been recovered. The air smelled of pine and cool soil. The trees swayed gently as the family stood together for the first time near the place they had searched for 16 years without knowing they were close. Rachel didn't cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the breeze settle against her face, imagining her sister standing beside her, laughing softly the way she used to whenever she tried to hold back tears. She whispered a thank you into the air, to the officers, to the search teams, to anyone who had refused to let the case fade completely into silence. Her father knelt down with great effort, placing a small wooden cross at the base of a tree. It wasn't a marker for grief. It was a marker for peace. A promise that Jenna's life mattered, that she would not be remembered only for how she had been lost, but for who she had been: kind, steady, hardworking, gentle, and full of quiet dreams that deserved to be spoken out loud even now. In town, the rafting company where Jenna had worked still stood. The paint was newer, the tour route slightly expanded, but inside the small office, a framed photo of Jenna remained on the back wall. New employees often asked who she was, and older ones would pause for a moment before telling her story. They spoke not of the tragedy first, but of her warm laugh, the way she organized gear with almost artistic precision, the way she would help new guides without ever making them feel inexperienced. They explained how the river had been her second home, and how she knew its currents like the patterns on her own palms. Her legacy continued not in grand gestures, but in the simple, everyday stories that shaped the place she once loved. Detective Arlen Whitford returned to the evidence room a month after the case was closed, walking along the shelves until he reached the box labeled with Jenna's name. He lifted it gently, weighing it in his hands. For years, this box had represented frustration and failure, an unanswered question that haunted every detective who touched it. Now it held the story of a solved case, a journey that had taken nearly 2 decades and had demanded resilience and patience softer than time but stronger than despair. He placed the box back on the shelf with a solemn nod. This chapter had ended, and for once, it had ended with truth instead of silence. The community held a small memorial service at a local hall, lit with soft candles and adorned with photographs of Jenna at different ages, standing in the river with her paddle, kneeling beside her dog, sitting on a cabin porch with sunlight on her face. People shared stories, laughter mixing with tears, and as Rachel listened, she felt something inside her unwind. The wound would never disappear, but it would no longer remain open. Healing had a beginning now. She breathed more easily, her shoulders dropping from years of tension she hadn't realized she carried. In the months that followed, Rachel grew closer to nature again, returning to hikes she once enjoyed, taking her camera along to capture wildflowers, dew on leaves, and sunlight filtering through branches. She felt her sister in those places, not in a painful way but in a quiet, comforting one. The woods no longer frightened her. They no longer represented loss. They felt like the home Jenna had once found in them. They felt like a place where memories could live without hurting. Walter Grimes, now serving his life sentence in an Idaho state prison, rarely spoke to anyone. He spent most days in a small cell, reading old books or staring out the narrow window at a sliver of sky. Guards said he rarely slept and often sat awake through the night, head bowed, as though replaying the same moment again and again. Some believed crime always catches up, even if justice arrives late. Others believed guilt becomes its own prison long before the bars close. Whatever the truth, Walter's life would end behind walls, with no chance of stepping beyond them again. And he never argued, never appealed, never attempted to escape the consequences he had created. Clearwater County slowly folded the solved case into its history, but people continued to talk about it for months, then years. Parents told their children about Jenna in cautionary tales meant to teach awareness. Teachers mentioned her name in local history lessons as an example of resilience in investigations. Her story became one of those threads woven quietly into a town's identity. Tragic, yes, but also proof that truth can survive even the longest winters. As time passed, Rachel created a small foundation in her sister's name. It focused on supporting search efforts for missing people in rural areas, providing resources to families who felt lost in the complexity of investigations. She didn't have the money for a large charity, but she had the determination. She organized hikes, fundraising events, and small speaking engagements where she shared Jenna's story with soft strength, not to dwell on pain but to encourage hope. Every donation felt like a spark traveling forward, lighting a path for families who feared their loved ones might be forgotten. One warm evening in 2025, Rachel visited the river where Jenna had worked. The water shimmered in the sun as rafters floated downstream, laughter echoing against the rocks. She sat on a boulder near the water's edge, letting the cool spray touch her face. She closed her eyes and listened to the river's steady movement, the same sound Jenna had heard every summer of her life. It was steady, dependable, constant, like the memory of her sister. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "We found you," and felt a calmness wash over her that she had never felt before. The world did not stop for tragedy, and it did not stop for justice either, but it changed those who had lived through both. Rachel walked back toward her car that evening with lighter steps, the river humming behind her like a promise. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the mystery, a life where her story was not defined only by loss but by the strength that had carried her through it. Jenna's cabin was eventually sold to a new owner who renovated it, painted the exterior a fresh shade of green, and added new furniture inside. The woods around it remained quiet, holding memories only the trees understood. The cabin's new occupant knew little about the history except that a woman once lived there, someone who had been well loved. Sometimes, on cool nights, the light from the newly installed porch lamp glowed softly through the trees, almost like the light that had once shone on the last night Jenna was seen. The wind brushed the branches the same way it had years earlier, but this time it carried peace instead of silence. In the sheriff's office, a bulletin board covered with missing persons posters still hung against the far wall. Some faces had been marked with updates: found safe, located, reunited. Others remained unsolved, their stories waiting for their own breakthroughs. Among the solved cases, Jenna's file sat with a small note pinned beside it: never forgot. No one knew who had written it, but every detective who saw it felt its meaning. This was why they searched. This was why they stayed late. This was why they reopened old files when new methods emerged, because every name deserved to be spoken. Every story mattered. Near the anniversary of the case's resolution, a local journalist published an article recounting the entire journey: the disappearance, the years of silence, the confession, the discovery, the trial, and the healing. The article ended with a simple line: some mysteries do not end with darkness. Some end with truth. It was shared widely across Idaho, touching hearts far beyond the small community where Jenna had lived and been lost. People commented, sharing their own stories of missing loved ones, of hope that still flickered, of prayers whispered into the night sky. And in all those words, Jenna's story continued moving forward, shaping lives she had never met. When the sun set on the final day Rachel visited the hillside, she looked out across the forest, breathing in the scent of pine and earth. She felt a sense of closure that was gentle, quiet, and complete. She placed her hand on the tree beside her and whispered, "I'll carry you with me," not out of grief now, but out of love. Then she turned and walked away as the wind brushed behind her, rustling the branches in a soft farewell. This story, like the woods that held its secrets for so long, settled into stillness. A mystery that once haunted a town was finally at rest. A family that once lived in endless uncertainty could finally breathe. And a young woman whose life had been interrupted too soon was finally found, finally honored, finally home. If you want more stories like this, deeper, stronger, and told with the same emotional truth, make sure you follow, stay connected, and subscribe. Because every voice here helps keep these stories alive and gives justice the space it needs to rise, no matter how many years have passed or how cold a case may become.